Welcome to part 3 of the Crash Course Cryptography. Today we're gonna dive a little bit deeper into some numbers and a little bit into math, because today we're gonna be talking about randomness and especially about random number generators. Now, I know that some people start with finite fields and explain the modular operations and so on. However, I have noticed, especially when I give talks and when I work with people, that a lot of people are really struggling with basic numbers. They are struggling with the size of a number, the probability, how to come up with these numbers. And in cryptography, random numbers are really important. So, after we have spoken about the basics of cryptography in part 1 and kind of symmetric and asymmetric in part 2, and you can find them in the description below, let's dive into some randomness. Randomness is something that surrounds us all the time because a lot of things in nature are random. Random means that if we have given an outcome before, it is impossible to know what's going to be the next outcome. So it's impossible to deduce from one outcome to the next one. And one of the very easy examples is if I take a coin and I flip the coin and I get a head, many people tend to believe the next one should be a tail because it's 50-50. But actually, the next outcome is completely independent from the outcome before. And we have this kind of randomness all the time in nature. We have this with the weather, we have this with the air, we have this with temperature, we have this with particles, we have this over and over again. An important part, if I ask you a question, let's say pick a random number from 1 to 10. You can pick a number. But so here's the important part. Whether you pick a number, let's say you pick the number 7, which oddly is the most popular number that people pick from 1 to 10, maybe you picked 7 as well, this number is not random. And here's the important part. You cannot have random numbers. You can only have a sequence with random distribution. Remember, randomness means that one outcome does not define the next outcome. And this is a really important concept that you can never forget. And this is very important. Now, when we go away from nature, that's so random, and we go to machines, especially to computers, we realize that many of these things, or actually all of these things, actually not random. They're what's called deterministic. So they work with predefined instructions. They have algorithms that are very predictable, the exact opposite of randomness. And here's the funny thing. Einstein once said that nature is actually not random. We're just not smart enough to understand the algorithm that's behind it. We cannot calculate it. And I don't know, whether you believe in this or who do you believe who creates this randomness and what randomness actually is in nature, let's put this aside. But I always think this is a really funny story that Einstein here brought up. Now, obviously, you're going to ask, so why do we actually need random numbers or randomness in cryptography? Well, especially when we talk about keys, and we're going to be talking about keys a lot. We talk about symmetric cryptography, we're going to talk about the advanced encryption standard, DES, which is not as used anymore, but especially also when we talk about the asymmetric encryption standards. It's going to be so important to understand how to come up with these numbers and how likely it is for someone else, an attacker, to come up with the same number. And this is very important because in so many cases people struggle with these concepts. They struggle how likely or how unlikely it is. Now let's go to the drawing board. We're gonna have some math and some numbers, and many times it's a bit easier to kind of see those rather than just hear it. So let's start off with some very basic numbers. And in most math, especially in cryptography, what we're doing is we're using 2 to the power of something. I have the wrong writing here. So we're using 2 to the power of something. So 2 to the power means that I have 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. So in this case, this is 2 to the power of 4. Okay, and I think this is really basic math. Now, where it gets really problematic is when we have really large numbers. So let's say we have 1,000. 1,000 is 2 to the power of how much? And we can say, and these are just some average math examples, that it's approximately 2 to the power of 10. Actually, it would be 2024, so it's not accurate, but we're just going to keep that 2 to the 10 is around 1,000. So my question is, 1 million is 2 to the power how much? And this is where it gets very, very, very important. 2 to the power of 20. Again, it's not accurate, but you can remember those things approximately. If I do 2 to the power of 30, and I hope you're getting the rhythm here, how much is this? Well, it's a billion. So this is very, very basic numbers, and the understanding of numbers. But now, let me ask you a couple of things. Imagine I have a piece of paper, and I'm folding this piece of paper all the time. So it's basically times 2, right? So when I fold it one time, it's 2 to the power of 1. I fold it a second time, it's 2 to the power of 2, 2 to the power of 3, 2 to the power of 4, and I'm folding it. Let's purely imagine it takes me 2 to the power of, let's say, 29, and I fold this paper, and it gets thicker and thicker and thicker, and it reaches from the Earth to the Moon. Let's just imagine, okay, this paper, and I fold it. In this case, I've folded it 29 times, and let's say it reaches from the Earth to the Moon. The crazy thing is it's actually quite realistic because of this exponential growth. Now, here's the question. How many more times do I have to fold it for the paper to reach back to Earth again? So it took me 29 folds to get from Earth to the Moon. How often does it take me to get back to Earth? One extra time. 2 to the power of 30. This is so confusing for many people because they don't understand exponentials. And this is something we are covering here today because it's very relevant when you talk about probability, because these numbers that we're talking about are so large. Some are large with 80 digits that I can't put them here. So we're always gonna, or mostly we're gonna use them as exponentials. And in this case, mostly it's 2 to the power of something. We could also do them at 10 of the power of something. But so I hope you understand this example here with the Earth and the Moon, because this really differentiates randomness and the likelihood of things happening. If I ask you, just as an example, we have a bike lock, okay? 4 digits on this bike lock. And we have the numbers from, or the digits from 0 to 9. How many different possibilities can I have here? Well, it's 10,000, so if I write this, why 10,000? Well, it's 10 to the power of 4, 10 different digits. It's 10,000. I could write this as 10 times 2 to the power of 10, right? Because that's 1,000, that's 10, 10,000. So let's keep this just as an example here so we can see the other numbers that are going to come up to understand a bit what is likelihood and how likely things can happen in this case. What's the probability to calculate these things? Now, if we ask, is it safe to use this bike lock to secure a bike? And we say yes, because, I mean, we chose those 4 numbers, and here's the important thing. A potential attacker very likely takes longer to try all these possibilities until I get back to the bike. So maybe if this attacker would have a week and the bike is really valuable, he or she could steal it. But if it's just gone for an hour, we know out of experience that it's almost impossible for someone to guess this. Now, obviously, as soon as we come to computer, we need to be working with way more randomness. We need to work with way bigger numbers. For example, if we talk about the lottery, right? This is where people completely get it wrong. Just as an example here as a comparison, do you know how likely it is to win the lottery? To win the lottery is, and depends in the country, right? Depends on the different kind of numbers. But let's say, and this is just the country I'm from Austria, you have approximately a probability 10 times, and here's the powerful now, 2 to the power of 30. So this is a billion, right? So it's approximately 10 billion. Now here's always the trick. Don't get confused here just because there's a difference of 10 and 30, right? People think, oh yeah, okay, this is not so much, like there's not so much difference. It's just 20 times the difference, right? So this is 20 times more likely. No. It's the exponential. It's the same thing as going from the Earth to the Moon. It takes 29 times to fold a paper to get to the Moon. It just takes 1 extra time to go back. And we could do this all over. Let's say it takes 50 times to get to the sun. I have no idea. I'm just guessing, right? How long does it take to get back? Exactly, the 51st time. And this is where it's very, very, very important to focus on these numbers and understand that these numbers are insanely big. right? This is a billion, this is 1 billion, this is 1,000. Now let's keep going. Let's say, what are the odds, random, for you to have the same fingerprint as someone else? Fingerprint. Well, it's very random, right? One, you have genetic predispositions, and then you have environmental factors. So what is the likelihood? And we could work it down, and we would realize fingerprint, right? And obviously this is not accurate because it's very difficult to do proper math on this, but it's approximately 2 to the power of 40. So 2 to the power of 40, this is not, just to explain this here, this is not 10 times more. So this is not 10 billion. It's not. This is factor 10. This is so much more, right? We have another 3 zeros. Remember, 2 to the power of 10 equals 3 zeros all the time. So this is a humongous difference, right? And we need these different kind of numbers, otherwise people would have the same kind of fingerprints. Now, let's keep going and understanding some of these numbers and understand how difficult it is to guess certain things. Let's work out a different example. Let's say a deck of cards. A deck of cards has how many cards? 52. You got it. Let's say we're shuffling, right? This deck of cards. What is the likelihood of me shuffling and then giving you the deck of cards and you shuffling and you getting the same kind of order in cards as I have? And you might think, well, there's a chance, right? I mean, it's only 52 cards, we can shuffle. But here's the thing. To calculate this, the probability, it is 52 factorial, because for the very first card, it could be 52 cards. Then for the second card, it could be all the other cards, which is 51, times 50, times 49, and so on. 52 factorial. And you can type this in your calculator, and you're going to come down with that this insane number is 2 to the power of 70 possibilities to shuffle a deck, approximately, right? I'm rounding here. 2 to the power of 70. Now, remember, this is not 30 times bigger than the fingerprint. This is 30 times exponential. This is an insane amount of money, insane amount of cards. And what you're going to be realizing is, if you shuffle really well, the odds of you creating a new set of deck, a new card set, is almost guaranteed. This is insane. You can shuffle, and you're going to create an order of cards that has not existed in the universe before, because of the power of randomness and the power of these really, really, really large numbers. So let's keep going, because here is where it gets very, very important. If we look at attack vectors, right? So let's look at attack vectors. Then we say, okay, I have this lock here with 4 digits. Well, I don't know how long it takes someone to crack this lock. Let's say they can do 1,000 combinations an hour, right? As a human, you roll it through. So it takes you, for 10,000, it takes you approximately 10 hours for a human to crack it, right? This is very, very realistic. Now, here is where it gets now really important. When we talk about computers, right, and we're talking about really strong computers, they can attack 2 to the power of 56 per second. Sorry, they can crack 2 to the power of 56 in approximately 4 minutes. That's how long it takes. So these are the possibilities it takes, and they crack the code, so they crack the unique number within 4 minutes. This is approximately the numbers these guys can do, or these computers can do. So if we look at this and we say, okay, so this deck of cards would be barely secure, right? I mean, in 4 minutes. So as soon as we talk about a bit of a longer time frame, a month, this stuff is hacked. Fingerprints, hacked within a couple of minutes, right? So all these things are absolutely not secure. So when we talk about randomness and probability in cryptography that has to be secure, we realize we need to have keys. If we take 2 to the power of 128, it normally takes long time. It takes 10 to the 18 years, right? So the reason this is not double, you could say, oh, this is just double here. This is not double, right? Remember the copying or the folding of paper to the moon. So this is why it takes so insanely long. And then obviously when we have larger keys, right? So these are just amount of possibilities. Here we are talking about 10 to the 37 years. This is an insane amount of time. I mean, this is a number with 37 zeros, right? And if we're talking about, and now it gets very, very important, 2 to the power of 256, which is, and you're gonna see this soon, we're gonna be talking about 10 to the 56 years. Now here's where it gets really important. When we are talking about generating random numbers, it is really important how big the potential key space is, right? So how many different possibilities do we have? Because this is how difficult it is to crack these things. And in Bitcoin, we are actually generating initially a key from 0 all the way to almost this number. It's not exactly, it's almost, depends on the prime number, but it's almost this number. So for someone to try to generate the same number, to guarantee to generate, it takes this amount of time. And just to kind of do the math, the universe has not existed that long. It won't exist that long because, just as an example, the universe exists 13.8 times 2 to the power of 30. So there's an insane difference here, right? Don't forget that. This is an insane difference. 30 to 56, insane difference. So, and we are assuming it's probably going to exist another 2 to the power of 20 or whatever we think, right? So this is an insane amount of number. And it's impossible to crack this stuff. Here, sorry, and here we're using 10 to the power of 56. If there's a completely different reference here, right? So don't forget, this is 10 to the power of 56. 10 to the power of 3, that's 1,000, equals 2 to the power of 10, right? So, so 2 to the power of 30 equals 10 to the power of 9, right? So we have a humongous difference in this entire kind of spectrum here. So in Bitcoin, we actually have a key space of, it's not accurate, but let's say 1 to the power of 256, and we're going to talk about the exact number when we talk about elliptic curve cryptography in some of the later episodes. So this is always what kind of freaks people out. It freaks people out that when they generate a random number that becomes their key, they always worry that someone else generates the same number. Now, we can just look at the other probabilities. It takes forever to calculate these things. We see the math, and that's why I wrote this down here, so that you can kind of get a bit of a feeling how long these things take. So now the only question then obviously becomes, how can we securely generate these different kind of random numbers? Because, of course, if I have, and let's talk about the simplest solution, how can I generate a number out of this, right? How can I be as random as possible? Because one thing that's the biggest mistake is that I go as a human and I do this as a human being. Well, I have a complete, like, I'm completely prejudged towards one of the numbers. So I might select a way too small number and it's way too easy to crack. So one thing that is truly random would be to go and have a coin and say heads is a 0 and tails is a 1. Because this is nothing else than a binary code, 0 and 1s, right, with 256 bits. And I will just write 0 and 1s. And then I have my 2 to the power of 256, and I throw the coin 256 times. Now, this would be absolutely fine, and we would call these things true random number generators, right? Or many people call them TRNGs. True number generators generate, as the name says, true random numbers. And the only way this is possible because the outcome stems from a physical process in nature that is random. Now, obviously, the question is always, where does physics get their probability from, right? But this is a different story. Now, you might ask, okay, so how does this work when I generate a random number on my computer? How does this work when a program does that? How does it work when a wallet does that? How does it work when a website does this? How does it generate these random numbers? Well, by using external factors that are random. For example, it could do temperature, it could do mouse movement, it could do shaking, it could do the exact pixel, it could do some time delay on some clicks. And this already brings some disadvantages, right? To generate true random numbers, I always need extra hardware. This is always, I need some connection to the outside world. A computer, by definition, cannot generate true random numbers. This is really important. The other thing is, it's not fast because it takes some time. And another huge problem is it's not reproducible. And the reason this is really a problem is because many times it's difficult to audit these hardware devices that are supposed to truly generate random numbers because it is so difficult to know if it was really random. And again, a number cannot be random. Only a sequence of numbers can be random by not being able to deduce from one number to the next number. And this is always the important thing. If you're using, for example, a hardware wallet like the Treasure or the Ledger, this is exactly what they're doing. When they are generating a private key, a random number, they're using all kinds of things. They can use noise, they can use temperature fluctuations. For example, in the Ledger, there's a chip in there called the STRNG, and it's standardized. It's a supposedly uber secure chip for generating random numbers. And it's been tested and tested and tested. But the problem is, it's very difficult to actually at the end say for sure that this thing is guaranteed random because it is not reproducible. You don't know until you've probably tested all of the numbers, and that is impossible to test because we don't have enough time in the universe to test this. 2 to the power of 56, maybe to put this into perspective, is 10 to the power of 80, which is more than atoms are in the universe. And to test all this through, if these numbers actually generate random numbers, it would take quite some time. And this is something that, well, is really important to understand. Now, in crypto, this is very important. When we are talking about cryptocurrencies now, not cryptography, you always want to work with true random number generators when you create your private key, especially in elliptic curve cryptography. This is where the biggest problems occur when people don't use a true random number generator, but they are using either something that's been faked, something that's been scammed, or they're not doing it at all. They're trying it out themselves. We have seen this over and over again, and this is a huge problem. And this is when private keys then get guessed because they were not random and they were predictable. Now, in cryptography though, and we're going to be talking about those, so I'm not going to go into detail now on the examples. I want to mention them because we're going to go into details along the line when we're talking about these examples. But I need you to understand what these numbers mean, how different these numbers are, how a 10 to the power of 3 is actually 2 to the power of 10, and that 2 to the power of 10 in comparison to 2 to the power of 9 is not a little bit more, is twice as much, right? This is the really important part because this explains power of exponentiation and the power of randomness when these numbers get really big. So let's talk about the non-true random number generators. There's one that's called the pseudo-random number generator. And here, as the name says, they are pseudo-random, and it works by having a function or by having some mathematical function where the numbers that get put out look random, they appear random, and it's computational quite expensive to calculate how did these numbers come into place. But in theory, it would be possible. And mainly there are two different types of methods where only one is pretty much used. I'm just going to write those down today. You can look them up if you want. We're not going to go too much into detail. The very first one is the middle square method. And the second one is the linear congruential generator. Just as an example how they work, so you kind of understand how they work, let's just use this example. You can look them up. Wikipedia describes this if you care about this. We're not going to be covering so much on this because in cryptography, in cryptocurrencies, we will need to use true random number generators because this is really essential. Otherwise, your money's at risk, right? So here we have a formula, and the formula looks, we have a seed, that's a starting point, right? Times A plus C and we take this mod m. So we have this mod m again, and we're going to be discussing this in the next episodes in detail. So now what you're going to see is, depending on how big this m is, right? So we could take a really, really, really large m. So this could be a prime, right? A really large prime, for example. And we could do this at somewhere at the 2 to the power of 40, right? It's an insane large number. And then we have this clock, basically. And in this modulus, and you will see this, we keep rotating through. So what we're going to get is we're going to get these insanely large numbers that, because of this weird function, appear random. And here's the important thing. It's impossible to go from the sequence and generate the next number, right? This is the key thing. So let's say these numbers, and I'm going to use small numbers now. This is absolutely incorrect, but just so you know. So let's say this is 9, 3, and then it jumps to 13. The next number is 1. So it's impossible to kind of deduct and say, hey, you know what? Actually, the next number should be question mark, right? You would need to know the entire algorithm. But there are a couple of downsides. And the downside is that, in theory, you can calculate this algorithm. And especially if you know the seed, then, and if this thing leaks, you can completely calculate the entire sequence, right? So this is a huge problem in those pseudo-random number generators. Now, obviously, and another problem is, especially with the mod function, once you will see this, the numbers will actually start repeating. So at some point, you cannot get more values out of this because you start repeating. And this is what's called a period. And so what you need to do is you need to have a really high m here to have a really, really, really large period. Because only then these things are not really calculatable anymore. And still, and here's the other problem, you will need to generate some kind of seed again. And what you do this for, you use this a lot in traditional cryptography, where you communicate and you have some kind of software without an external hardware where you can both come up with a number. And this is the key thing. The big upside on this is it's reproducible. This is the key thing. It looks random, but it's still reproducible. And I only need software, no hardware. Now, obviously, the downside, if I have leaks and this thing leaks, or I calculate it back, this is where it gets really, 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 really scary. And so this is where this is very, very difficult and very important to understand. And we have a third version, and these are similar to the pseudo-random number generators, just these are cryptographically secure. Secure pseudo-random number generators, okay? So this is the third version. So we have the second version, the pseudo-random number generators, P, R, and G. The true random number generators, and these are cryptographically secure. Why does it do that? People always complain I have such bad handwriting, I know. So here, let's put some style into this. Great, fantastic. So how are they different? Well, they are different in a way that even though you know all the numbers, or you know as many numbers ever, it is still impossible to deduce any of the backwards numbers, because we are using some cryptographic function that is very, very, very secure. And there's different ways, and we're going to actually be talking about some of those in the examples. We can use ciphers here for the cryptographic function at the beginning. It could be a hash function. We could have some really hard math functions, and so on. So the big difference between the cryptographically secure pseudo-random number generators and the regular pseudo-random number generators is that it is way harder to crack this function. Here, this is a very simple function with the mod m, so you could basically back calculate that. But what you do here is you have complete one-way functions. And we're going to be talking about a lot of those one-way functions in the later episodes. And then suddenly it becomes computationally very, 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 very expensive to crack those things. And it's going to be quite interesting to see how they all fall into place. So I hope today you didn't get completely confused with all these different types of numbers. 2 to the power, we're talking about exponentiation, to 10 to the power of something. I hope you understand the power and the difficulty. If you pick a random number that's large enough, how it is impossible for an attacker to potentially guess that number. And we talked about how you actually generate such a random number. One of the basic ways would be just a coin, some external force. But then obviously you also want to do this with hardware in case of a computer or in case of a hardware wallet. Let me know if you have any questions. Let me know if you like these things. Give me a thumbs up for this video. Subscribe. In the next episode, we're going to go deeper into the math. We're going to actually talk about finite fields. We're going to talk about this modulus function. And it's going to be the basis, especially when we're talking about, we're briefly going to cover symmetric algorithms in detail. But then when we go into the asymmetric ones. So I hope you're having fun. I hope you're learning. See you at the next episode. Yours truly, Julian.